Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm your host, Dori Pham. Join me and my fellow public policy classmates as we explore potential policy solutions for today's most pressing societal challenges. Today I'm joined by Ambassador Jeffrey DeLaurentis, a career diplomat who has played an important role in U.S. foreign policy over several decades. Ambassador DeLaurentis studied at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. During his foreign service, he served in several posts, including Havana, Cuba, where he later returned as the top U.S. diplomat during the historic normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba in 2015. He also served as U.S. ambassador for special political affairs at the United Nations, representing the United States in complex multilateral negotiations. Today, we'll discuss how his education shaped his approach to diplomacy, his experience during the U.S.-Cuba diplomatic opening, and what lessons diplomacy offers in today's complex international environment and conflict. So to start off, let's dive back to your education at Georgetown School of Foreign Service and Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. So those two schools is often seen as the gold standard for diplomats. How did those institutions shape the way you think about diplomacy and how diplomacy as a practical craft rather than just theory?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I would say initially that when I was growing up and had expressed an interest in diplomacy, coming from a Catholic family, I mean, the place I immediately looked to was the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. There was the sort of Jesuit ethos that was important, but of course, Georgetown essentially has trained many American and foreign diplomats. It's in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, an extra advantage. And it's really an exposure to practitioners of foreign policy. And so I think that became very important to be exposed to how things worked, beyond the important classes that we were taking and the important academic foundation that that I was building and that many others build. At Columbia, it was kind of the same thing, but in New York City, which I would say is the second headquarters for international affairs. The UN is there. I was quite interested in the UN. Columbia, the School of International and Public Affairs, had a number of very high-profile professors, practitioners in the field, and so all of this, I think, helped basically solidify my interest in diplomacy and helped me prepare. But subsequent life experiences also were equally valuable.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you got your master's at Columbia, and then now at the end of your career, you served as United Nations ambassador in New York. So it's like a full circle moment. So let's dive a bit to your career where you spent time in Havana, Cuba. And that part was your early career. And then you later returned to the US as like a top US diplomat during normalization between the two countries. So, how did your understanding of Cuba evolve over time? And what surprised you the most when you came back?
Well, I should say initially that frankly I hadn't really looked to Latin America at all in terms of what I had hoped my diplomatic career would be. I had visions of I don't know, Prague and Budapest and Berlin dancing in my head when I joined, but lo and behold, my first assignment was to Havana, Cuba. I was there, ironically, when the flag of the Soviet Union came down and the Russian tricolor went up, and watched the Soviet citizens essentially file out of the country almost overnight. And of course, at that point, Cuba was going through a particularly difficult time, the so-called special period in the sign of peace, because in the time of peace, rather, because they had lost all the support of the Soviet Union. The economy contracted by 35%, I think was the number at the time. So it was a tough time. But at the same time, I understood and maybe realized that Americans and Cubans had a lot more in common than they really wanted to admit. There were, of course, decades and decades of close interaction between Americans and Cubans, and I would say by the end of my tour, my first tour, would have been in 1993. I was pretty much convinced that the policy that we had in place really wasn't working. I did return for a second time in 1999 to 2002, during which we had tried to initiate some opening, travel and remittances and these sorts of things, which had been implemented the year before when I was over at the NSC. I mean, not because I was there, but it was something that President Clinton wanted to do. So in effect, I returned to Cuba to implement these changes. And then President Bush came in and reversed some of those. And so we were in this kind of seesaw. And then, as you note, I returned in 2014, hoping that the negotiations underway between the two countries would lead to the opening that ensued during the second term of the Obama administration. But I would say essentially, my own views evolved because I arrived on the island in 1991, convinced of the current policy at the time. But again, by the time I left, I just had a different view, and Cuba began to change a little bit. They were experimenting with economic reforms and so forth, and it just felt to me like we should be creating an environment in which that could be encouraged and pushed along. And again, when I returned then in 2014 for the third time, I was pretty much convinced that again, economically, mostly Cuba was beginning to change, and the best way for us to affect that change, to influence that change, was to engage. And I still believe, after all these years, that it was really the best way to advance American values and kind of have an impact on the ground and promote the universal values that we hold dear.
Yeah. So during the 2015 U.S. and Cuba thaw, What proved to be the hardest barrier to rebuilding trust after more than decades of estrangement?
I would say was building trust. When the secret negotiations began in the latter part of the first half of 2013, there was just massive distrust of American intentions, and so to build that trust, to begin to have the sort of relationship that you need with interlocutors, even adversaries, to make any progress, this took a lot of time, and so it was really building trust and learning to talk to each other as human beings and not as adversaries, as enemies. And this took an enormous amount of effort.
Yeah. So diving deeper into um, that negotiations, what would you say is the most important foreign policy that that implemented or helped with the normalizations between the two countries?
Social injustice, health disparities, and climate change. Are you interested in pressing challenges like these facing our region and world? Make your impact by joining the next cohort of the UCR Master of Public Policy program. Learn more at mpp.ucr.edu.
Town, we had objectives. They had objectives. And so it's a function of negotiating those and everybody walking away with something, as it were. Again, this is sort of painstaking. I mean, my own particular experience was with the negotiating the reestablishment of diplomatic relations, which ran from January of 2015 to July of the same year. It took us more or less that amount of time, and there were various issues on both sides. Of course, both presidents had indicated publicly on December 17th, 2014, that we were going to get to that point. So we were certainly under some pressure to achieve it. But again, it's sitting down and figuring out how to relate to one another in a way that that will move things forward. Obviously, again, we had our interests; they had theirs. But it's it's emotional intelligence, it's trust, it's again trying to figure out how to how to secure the objectives that you set in place.
Yeah. So looking back, what do you think the United States most misunderstood about Cuba during the years of severed relations? And what lessons does that hold for the other long-standing conflicts today?
So it's a hard question, but I guess I imagine that the notion of nationalism and independence being very much wrapped up in the revolution. Yes, it became a communist one-party state, but almost as much of it had to do with kind of maintaining an independence. They developed quite a geopolitical profile in the early days of the revolution in the 70s and 80s before the Soviet Union fell, and I think the hatred or animosity, toward the U.S. by the leadership was maybe a lot deeper than we realized, and that, it feels to me, drove a lot of the decisions that they made, and I'm not sure we had a good handle on that. Again, of course, during the Cold War, it became much more difficult situation to deal with. But frankly, every administration on the American side tried in one form or another to figure out a way to improve the relationship that would advance U.S. interests, which is the task of every administration. But again, because of the Cold War, and then after, because of the determination to maintain independence and this kind of nationalistic fervor, I think, made it more complicated.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience during your time at Cuba. So, speaking of today's issues and problems, recently the United States and Israel has launched a large-scale strike on Iran, and the conflict has already expanded across several countries in the region. From a diplomatic perspectives, what channels remain open when the military escalation reaches this level?
Well, look, it's hard for me to say. I have the impression from our leaders that at the moment they're not particularly interested in diplomatic discussions. They clearly made the decision that the discussions that had been underway were not progressing in a way that they wanted them to. And on the Iranian side, I've heard, I guess it was the foreign minister yesterday, say they're not interested in speaking until the military action stopped. So I think we'll just have to see how this goes. Again, it would be no surprise for me to say that I thought the approach during the Obama administration and the JCPOA that was generated was a much better way to deal with this. But obviously, the current administration has taken it in a different direction, and we'll see. It is fair to say that many people, most people, would like to see change in Iran. The question is, do you go about attempting to affect that change militarily, or do you try to do it diplomatically and peacefully? And well, again, the administration has made its choice, and we'll have to see how it turns out. The other thing I might mention is you can't really have diplomacy without a professional diplomatic corps, and we have lost a good part of our diplomats, professional career diplomats, in this particular administration, which I think is unfortunate.
I see. So, in your personal opinion, you mentioned that the U.S. could have prevented this war using diplomatic channels. How would they do that?
Well, that's always the hope, of course. And as I understood, negotiations were underway, and I guess it was on the U.S. side that they decided to halt that effort. But again, you sit down and you try to figure out a way to reach your objectives through diplomacy. I'm not aware of the intimate back and forth of the negotiations over the last few weeks, but I certainly would have liked to have seen a greater effort in that area. I think the administration has tried to explain why it decided to go the direction that they did. And again, we'll just have to see how it goes.
So, drawing back from your career in Havana, Cuba, um, the the tensions between the two countries are really high at that time, but never got to a point where it's a full-on attack like the United States and Iran incident today. Is there like a point where the relationship between the two countries came really close to a full-scale war?
I would say the Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the way back in 1962 is probably the best example of we were on the brink of an exchange of nuclear weapons, practically, and so that was a very, very difficult moment. Again, there have been lots of books and articles written about how the Kennedy administration handled that. I also think, at least for me personally, one of the most impactful statements that that President Kennedy made, and which I only studied maybe many years after that. I was very young during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Was a speech he gave at American University on June 10th, 1963. So that was several months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he basically said the United States and the Soviet Union need to figure out a way to get along. We can be competitors and rivals and adversaries, but we shouldn't develop a hatred for the Russian people. He cited, various accomplishments that Russians had achieved, and again, the basic message was we need to develop a more mature relationship. And frankly, even though we were very significant adversaries, and I thought about that a lot during our negotiations with Cubans, 25, however many years after that. Sorry, more than 25, 40 years after that speech.
Back to the U.S.-Iran conflict. I think it was yesterday where Iran installed a new supreme leader after the death of his father during the conflict. How might leadership transition during wartime affects the prospects of negotiation or the escalation?
Again, it's all speculation, but I think President Trump has said that he wanted to have a role in the future leadership of Iran. Iran has now selected its own leader, which I think suggests that at least at the moment they have no intention of going anywhere. The response on the American side was, well, he probably won't be around very long. He's the new supreme leader. I think the Israelis have indicated that he's now a legitimate target, as his father was. So again, we'll just have to see how this plays out. But so far, from what one sees in the media and reads and so forth, the Iranian side is digging in. How long that lasts, we'll have to see.
So Iran has responded with missile and drone strikes across the Gulf and has threatened shipping routes such as the Strait of Hormuz. In your experience, how do diplomats prevent a regional conflict from spiraling into a broader international war?
Well, again, I think it's up to the governments concerned to do the best they can to ensure that doesn't happen. Again, I'm outside looking in, so I'm not aware of the various conversations. I think the countries that have been affected in the Gulf have shown tremendous restraint, given the fact that the civilian targets have been hit, and it's probably more and more difficult for them to maintain that that posture. So we are getting closer to an additional escalation. But again, I'm not privy to the negotiations and the discussions going on between the various parties. I'm sure they're going on, and by that I mean not necessarily with the Iranians, but among the various countries that have been affected by this conflict.
Yeah, so we typically ask this question of all our guests. If you were given a magic wand and that wand can solve a single issue, how would you solve the issue between Iran and the US? What policies would you implement, or what diplomatic way would you would you implement to end this war? And is that the best course of action for that you would recommend the United States to do right now?
Well, again, I'm not really privy to the discussions underway, or to the planning that led up to this, or the negotiations between Iran and the U.S. I always think it's better to try and resolve things diplomatically. We did see that achieved during the Obama administration. The Trump administration came in and tore up the agreement, and we're now at war. I think the under normal circumstances, an administration would kind of build support. I don't think the majority of the American people support this. Some certainly do, but I think the majority do not. We're seeing, energy prices go up, oil prices go up, gasoline prices. Stock market is going a bit crazy. So the magic wand would be that this get resolved peacefully. Obviously, there should be negotiations that would curb Iran's support for these proxy groups, getting to their ballistic missile program, and so forth. And I think had the agreement, the JCPOA agreement, not been torn up back in 2017, that those kinds of negotiations would have begun. So I just think that diplomacy is always the best way, and I'm unconvinced of the need to go to war at this point, rather than trying to solve it another way.
So, looking back at other moments of crisis, such as the Cold War or the Iran nuclear negotiations, what diplomatic lessons might apply to managing tensions with Iran today?
Well, again, I think the diplomatic lesson is that you need to stick with diplomacy, if you can, and keep going. Now, I suppose some would argue that, well, that was tried and it didn't work, so we had to do it this way. Again, I'm not convinced. But when you just shun the diplomatic option, I think it's a little bit irresponsible. But again, I'm not really privy to the negotiations underway. So that's really the best the best that I can offer, and hopefully the parties can get back to the negotiating table in some way.
So let's transition back to the later moments of your career when you served as the U.S. Ambassador for Special Political Affairs at the United Nations. How does diplomacy change when you are negotiating with a single country versus navigating a room of nearly 190 people, diplomats?
Well, multilateral diplomacy is a little bit like three-dimensional chess. You know, you're not focused on one interlocutor, but in the Security Council, it would be 14 other countries. Where I spent most of my time in the General Assembly, it would be 192. In the Security Council, the idea, the objective was when you walked into a meeting, when you were going to vote on something, you wanted to be pretty sure what the outcome would be. And you would start, in a sense, talking to each member of the council to ensure that that they were supporting your particular position, and inevitably there would be a couple of countries, and you have to kind of round up everyone to make sure they're on your side, so to speak, and then try and pressure others to go along, or to at least abstain. So it's a juggling act, and you're also, of course, negotiating with your own folks back in the Americans' case back in Washington that have a particular view, and maybe it's a little bit different of what you think might be possible to achieve around the table. So it's kind of a constant back and forth, and fascinating to me always. And then, of course, afterwards, particularly in a very large vote like the General Assembly, you would say, okay, why did this country vote this way? Why did this batch of countries abstain? You generally know who's going to vote no on a particular initiative. And so, again, it's obviously trying to pursue your American interests and seek the outcome that you wish, but just with a few more steps.
So, in high pressure negotiations, which skill mattered the most? Technical expertise, emotional intelligence, or political instinct? And how can one compensate for the absence of another?
I actually think that emotional intelligence probably is the most important. If you have a decent relationship with your interlocutor, adversary or not, there's a certain level of professionalism and trust. I think that that helps a lot. Of course, you have to have a political instinct in terms of what will be acceptable back in your capital, and what the impact will be. Technical expertise is important, but it's one would generally rely on others who are who have that expertise to advise accordingly. Now, I was not involved in the JCPOA agreements negotiations, but of course, technical expertise in that situation was very, very important because you're talking about enriching uranium and nuclear technology and so forth. So that was more, I would say, unique. But at least in the things that I was dealing with, it would be again emotional intelligence and political instincts that were the most important.
So, as a career diplomat, were you trained on refining these set of skills, or are you just, you naturally have it?
I would say, of course, you're trained for certain situations and to focus on particular skills, but I think ultimately you acquire them as you go along. For some, maybe they're natural talents. For others, they're acquired talents. But you definitely need them to be successful. And a lot of these things are really on-the-job training, I would say. You learn them as you go along and as you kind of understand the position of your country, the way others perceive your country, what your role should or shouldn't be, how intrusive or not you should be. These kinds of things. And of course, what I found particularly early in my career was most countries, certainly not all, always wanted to see American leadership and look to the United States for that leadership. So you pretty quickly kind of acquire, at least I hope so, the ability to make some of these tough decisions along the way, and then bring along your friends and allies, and sometimes adversaries to the point that you want to get to.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you need to. Earlier, you mentioned that you need to understand when negotiating what the capital wants and like its capabilities. So my question out of curiosity is, who do you mainly report back to, and who makes that final decision between negotiating in the two countries? For example, between US and Cuba, who makes the final decision?
Well, it varies from issue to issue, of course. In the case of Cuba, ultimately for the very big decisions, the president would decide, but for a lot of them, it would be the national security advisor or the deputy national security advisor, along with the Secretary of State. The Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. There are, of course, grades, categories of decisions. Some, can be made locally in Havana, some in collaboration with others. And then I would say in the big ones, it would go all the way up to the president. But remember in the case of Cuba during the Obama period, it was the Deputy National Security Advisor and the Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council who negotiated the initial sort of first step that was announced on December 17th, 2014. And so certainly the NSC had a major role to play in terms of the establishment of diplomatic relations. that really then moved over to the State Department, if you will, to negotiate that under the guidance of the Secretary of State and with the NSC clearly and closely following. But and then, of course, there are a slew of other issues where different levels and different agencies would be required to engage.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. So so my dream job is to be a diplomat, just like you. What would what would be the best advice you would give to students right now who wants to enter the foreign service and be a career diplomat?
Well, I would certainly encourage it. It's a very fulfilling profession. You have to be willing to move around a lot, which of course can be difficult for partners, spouses, families, whatever. But the ability to engage with cultures, nationalities from around the world, I always found extremely stimulating. My best advice is to be as current as you can with what's going on in the world. Read, I don't know, The Economist, Time Magazine, whatever, every week to keep up with everything, and the major newspapers, and to learn how to write, a very critical skill, and learn how to speak and present and so forth, as of course you're doing with this podcast. So I think these are essentially skills to get you through the examination processes and the rest.
So being a diplomat is not a well-known. Well, it's well-known, but it's not like publicized. Like, for example, many people who they don't know how or what diplomat do on a day-to-day basis. Can you walk through your standard day, walk us through the normal day-to-day, what you do every single day, what are the most common tasks, or what are some things that are unique and special to this career field?
Again, it would depend upon what account, if you will, what country you're working with, or whether you're in a multilateral job. But I would say, for example, at the UN, you would come in the morning, you'd look at the overnight sort of cable traffic from particularly on the issues that you are following. There might be a morning meeting to talk about who's going to do what during the day and what the status is of various negotiations that are underway, because of course many of them take days, sometimes weeks, not just a couple of hours in a meeting. And then maybe at 10 o'clock, there's a Security Council meeting on some particular issue. You need to make sure that you have your briefing papers and the statement that you need to give, make sure that's all lined up. You go to the meeting, that takes you to lunch. Maybe there's an official lunch of some kind. Maybe not. Then in the afternoon, perhaps there's a meeting of the General Assembly or another meeting of the Security Council, or you're busy working on your initiatives, the resolutions or statements, or press remarks for some other issues that you're working on that are coming to fruition. At the end of the day, and so that would mean meeting with other missions, other countries, negotiating informally various things. at night, maybe there's a reception, maybe it's somebody's national day or whatever. And while folks make fun of diplomats for wearing striped pants and going to cocktail parties, actually those events you can get an enormous amount of work done because everybody is there, and you can do your own little whatever particular issue you're moving on, or you collude with a bunch of allies or like-minded on a particular issue. And by the way, the like-minded change depending upon the issue. So these are the kinds of things that one would do on a normal day at the UN.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. So to wrap up, when you reflect on your career and your career in Cuba and the United Nations, what decision are you most proud of, and what gives you hope about the future of diplomacy in an era of great power competition?
Jeepers, that's a tough question. Look, I was I was very proud of my involvement in the effort to normalize relations with Cuba, with a longstanding adversary. I happen to be of the view that had that process been allowed to continue, we would be in a very different place. I know many would disagree with that, but the issue of Cuba, for whatever reason, ended up dominating my career, and of course, again, being part of this process where you're working through with an adversary various ways to advance U.S. interests and rebuild or start to rebuild a relationship. That's a pretty it's a very unique experience. I also enjoyed very much my work at the UN. There were several resolutions and statements that we were able to negotiate that that I'm particularly proud of, and so I think I had a good run, and anyway, now on to the next chapter, and I'll let other people decide how useful or not these experiences were.
Thank you for listening to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UCR_SPP. To learn more about our program and upcoming episodes, visit spp.ucr.edu. For the video version of this episode, check out our YouTube channel at UCR School of Public Policy. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.